All right. This is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. Got chapter 20, Between Europe and China, 1500 to 1750. We'll be looking at section 1, the Ottoman Empire to 1750. So these dates here are important in terms of outlining the time period we're looking at. 1500 is roughly the discovery of the New World. And we've talked a lot about how the discovery fundamentally altered global economics, politics, and even culture to a certain degree. 1750 is roughly the year of what we might refer to as the dual revolutions. We'll get to that in another chapter, but most importantly of these dual revolutions, and one of them is the Industrial Revolution. And this is a monumental event in world history, so much so that you could argue that it's the most significant change to happen to human beings since the beginning of, the human species. So we're looking specifically between these two monumental events, right? 1500 to 1750, after the discovery of the New World, but before really the Industrial Revolution. We'll be focusing on this first section on the Ottoman Empire. We got a map here, so we can go ahead and outline a little bit of what we're talking about. This chapter is called Between Europe and Asia. So let's go ahead and just mark some of these things. So this is, well, let's not maybe use orange for this. Let's use blue. So on this side, we have Europe. And we already talked to a great degree about Europe. Over here, you have Asia. We have yet to really discuss that. And so this chapter then focuses, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily on these three empires which occupy the central region here. We'll be looking first at the Ottoman Empire. That is the green one here. So this is the Ottoman. Actually, let's write this arrow out here so we can read it better. Ottoman. The orange one here is an empire called the Safavid. And the pink is what we call the Mughal, right? So the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal. We're looking at this one for now, the Ottomans right here. So the Ottoman Empire was an empire that was founded primarily from Turkish-speaking people in an area called Anatolia. Anatolia is, again, if you're not entirely familiar with the geography, is what modern-day Turkey is. It is this piece of land right here, right? So that is the origins, essentially, of the modern Ottoman state. The ruler who is credited for its foundings. The Ottoman Empire was founded by a previous ruler named Osman, O-S-M-A-N. And that's where the term Ottoman comes from, one of these very early rulers. But early on, this Turkish state was still, you might say, kind of in its infancy. It wasn't until the rule of Mehmed the Conqueror that the Ottoman Empire really became a political force to be reckoned with. As you can tell from the name, the Conqueror, Mehmed was successful in taking the Byzantine capital city of Constantinople. So this was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire was an Orthodox Christian state. It was the last remnants, in many ways, of the old Roman Empire. Back in the 400s, the Roman emperors moved the capital of Rome from Rome to Constantinople into the east. The Western Roman Empire fell, but the Byzantine Empire continued to thrive. The Orthodox Christian state, this lasted roughly from, we'll just say, roughly 400 CE when the capital was moved to, I believe, 1453 was the date where the Ottomans captured it. So this was an empire that lasted really for 1,000 years. The Ottomans, on the other hand, they're primarily Turkish in ethnicity, but also primarily Muslim, right? So there's differences in language and differences in religion here. One reason why Mehmed was successful, so right next to Mehmed the Conqueror, we'll say that he captured Constantinople. And, was successful militarily against other states. So, for example, Mehmed was also successful. We might just say expanded the Ottoman state through conquest. That's really what he was known for. One of the reasons why the Ottomans were successful in capturing Constantinople was the use of gunpowder, which increasingly becomes more and more powerful. You may hear these various states, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. You may also hear them collectively referred to as the gunpowder empires. And it's really the ability to wield this. Gunpowder is not necessarily new, but gunpowder being an effective weapon is new. For most of the medieval period, so for example, for most of the time period that the Byzantine Empire existed, 400 CE to 1453, it was fortifications that were really difficult to attack, castles, walls, and what proved to be the difference was that by 1453, gunpowder and especially cannon was technologically advanced enough so that the walls of castles guarding Constantinople could be easily blasted down with cannon. And so therefore, the Ottoman state, whenever it encountered a foe, fortified up in a castle, whereas, maybe 100 years earlier, the technology didn't exist to blow those walls down. Now it does. And this is one of the key signs of how the medieval period comes to a conclusion with this technology. But gunpowder in those days also had another maybe restrictive feature to it, and that was the fact that it was very expensive. And so it only was a handful. In this case, between Europe and Asia, it was only 3 states that could muster up the resources required to utilize this technology and again, kind of gobble up and conquer all the much smaller states. After the successful conquest of Constantinople, Mehmed the Conquerors and others renamed the capital city to Istanbul. So this is the capital of the Ottoman state. This was, again, the remnants of Constantinople, which was captured. The Byzantine Empire was conquered. To give you an idea of where it is geographically, maybe we'll go ahead and use a yellow star or something like that. Constantinople is in this region right there. It's right along that strait. So it is strategically placed at that area. While Mehmed is credited with most of the conquest, by far the most significant and successful ruler of the Ottoman Empire was Suleiman the Magnificent. The rulers or emperors of the Ottoman state were referred to as sultans. So sultan is simply just a ruler title. That's what they were called. And under Suleiman the Magnificent, the state both expanded, maybe we could say, wealth grew. Also under Suleiman the Magnificent, there's also significant centralization. That is to bring in really all aspects of the empire. Suleiman's military conquest stretched as far as Vienna. Vienna is in Austria. However, the Ottomans were defeated, so we might say that this was the extent of Ottoman expansion. Like I said before, Suleiman's rule is considered to be the golden age of the Ottomans in terms of military success, wealth, centralization of the state. And the Ottomans also rivaled both the Italian city-state of Venice and Portugal. So we might say about this is that these were both Ottoman rivals. Recall in, I believe maybe it was chapter 16 or 17, we talked about how the Portuguese expanded in the Indian Ocean. The Ottomans frequently went to war with the Portuguese in various parts of the Indian Ocean in order to challenge Portuguese dominance there. So, and Venice is an Italian city-state in Italy, and so the Ottomans would have gone to war in the Mediterranean and challenged Italian power in that area, or really just the power of Venice. So in terms of building a centralized state, actually one more thing, we'll just go ahead and take note of Ottoman expansion. So the Ottomans came to control territories including Egypt, modern-day Palestine and Syria, of course, Anatolia, Iraq. Cities like Baghdad were under Ottoman control. Much of the Balkans, Greece was in Ottoman control, Serbia in Ottoman control, and of course Vienna, which is right here. And that was really some of the extent to which the Ottomans expanded into Europe. After that point, it essentially was halted. In terms of centralizing the state, so there's a lot of territory here under Ottoman control, a lot of different people who live in it, a lot of different languages, a lot of different ethnicities. How does the Sultan maintain control of this empire? Well, the Ottomans used a couple of very sort of unique practices. These were similar but also different from some of the ways that other states centralized power, like the Spanish monarchy or the French monarchy. One was the Janissaries. The Janissaries were professional. Maybe, yeah, we'll say professional. Trained soldiers loyal to the Sultan. So the Janissaries essentially started off as like the Sultan's bodyguards, essentially, but then the ability for the Sultan to extract taxes from such a large population, and you also have to factor in the increased trade coming from the New World, facilitating itself to the Ottoman state, that a lot of the wealth the Ottomans found went directly into the Sultan's pocket. He used that money to hire essentially personal bodyguards that turned themselves into pretty much the Ottoman army. And so this was a good way to undercut maybe some of the traditional military units, which were nobility who owned land in the Ottoman state. And the Janissaries were, because they were relatively new, they had not learned military ways of the past, like riding horses, using spears, shooting a bow and arrow. These soldiers were very easy to convert into gunpowder troops. So there was no there wasn't any sort of cultural transition that needed to take place, whereas a lot of the cavalry units who had owned land in the Ottoman state, guns were kind of uncomfortable. They were too big. It just didn't work well with those sort of troops. One of the ways in which the Janissary Corps was staffed was through a system called devshirme. Devshirme is the practice of what we might call kidnapping. Actually, I think there's, check the spelling on kidnapping real quick. I think there's two P's. Yep, two P's. So the practice of essentially kidnapping young Christian boys to serve the Sultan. And most of these were people who were located in the Balkans region, right? So it would have been coming from mostly, this area right here. But it was important, well, maybe not important, but, one of the reasons as to why it was especially Christian boys was because then at least that child and the family had no other allegiance to the Islamic faith, which was the predominant faith in the Ottoman state. See, the Sultan was not necessarily the religious leader. He was only the political leader. And so there was certainly competition in the Ottoman state, and you might think of this as kind of the three centers of traditional power. You had the emerging Sultan, you had the Islamic clerics, these are the religious leaders, and then you had the nobility. And these would have been those who owned the land. And it's this power struggle between the three. And so by hiring, or by specifically kidnapping young Christian boys, you can kind of oust this sort of power of competition. Those that served in the cavalry were given land grants. Oftentimes this land was on the outskirts of the empire to remove a threat to the Sultan. right? So you take this group here, the landed nobility, you give them land, which appeases them, which is good, but you also give them land on the very far outskirts of the empire, and that allows for, that doesn't allow for them to rise up and revolt against the Sultan and challenge his power. Instead, he can rely only on the Janissaries. Those that were, the devshirme was used in order to staff the Janissary corps, but also some of the devshirme was used to staff general government positions. So tax collectors, record keepers, any sort of bureaucracy could have come from this devshirme system as well. Anybody who belonged to either the military or government class was called askeri. So this is either anybody who belonged to the military. I mean, it's more or less the military class, but it could include people working for the government. And these people were exempt. Exempt from taxes. In terms of law code, the Sultan really struggled to establish a centralized legal system. It didn't really exist. Instead, it was Sharia, which was religious law. So when it came to anything besides really tax collection, when it came to how people should live their everyday lives, it was mostly dictated by local mosques rather than the Sultan's power. So at least in that respect, when it came to local law, the Islamic clerics still maintained a certain degree of power. And this was true for a lot of other religious minorities too. So for the most part, even though the Ottoman Empire was an empire which was predominantly Islamic, where the ruling class was predominantly Turkish, for the most part, local language, culture, and laws really continued to thrive in the Ottoman state. Here we have a picture of the Hagia Sophia, or the Hagia Sophia. This had been previously the largest church, Christian church, in the world before the Middle Ages, from maybe the year, I think 600 was around when it was built, maybe earlier, till about the year 1200. So for 600 years, the Hagia Sophia was the largest Christian church in the world. When the Ottomans took this over, it was in Constantinople. This was in the Byzantine Empire. When the Ottomans took it over, they transitioned it and turned it into a mosque rather than a Christian church. And the Sultan's palace was right next to it. So you might want to compare this with something like the Palace of Versailles in France, the Hagia Sophia. After Suleiman's rule, though, the Ottoman Empire entered into a very long period of decline. In fact, one way to characterize the Ottomans is this sort of persistent and steady decline. Crisis of the military state, 1585 to 1650. Economically speaking, all the silver coming in from the New World caused inflation. So we might say New World silver. Even though silver was abundant, there was so much of it that it wiped out people's savings. It was so abundant that it sort of lost its value. That's essentially what inflation means. In terms of climate, the Little Ice Age occurred. This was in the, maybe from like 1590 to 1610 or so. The Little Ice Age is a period in world history around the 1600s mostly, where the globe was especially cold, and this caused an unusual amount of harvests to fail. This led to rebellions throughout the empire. A lot of that perhaps contributed by bad harvests, which again, people were hungry, more likely to cause some sort of rebellion. The sultans themselves became, as time went on, relatively detached from the everyday affairs of the empire. Palace sultans, we might say that the sultans became isolated and detached from the state. Instead, it was viziers or grand viziers, which could be found via the devshirme system, who did most of the actual government. The sultans more or less engaged themselves in pleasure. Many concubines were housed at the Ottoman palace, eating fancy foods, drinking the fanciest drinks, living the luxurious life, meanwhile completely oblivious to knowing what's going on outside the palace. Viziers were the ones who did the actual governing. Once again, the Ottomans suffered a defeat militarily. This was the second attack on Vienna, which is Austria. And once again, the Ottomans defeated. We can really point to this point here in 1683, and that was, in a lot of ways, the last kind of hurrah militarily for the Ottoman state. The Ottomans engaged themselves in a number of wars after this period, but mostly are on the losing side. So in terms of expanding its borders, this is kind of, you might say the peak of that. Commodities flooded into the Ottoman state. Tobacco and coffee became very, very frequent. These were frequent and popular commodities. They were mostly imported, though. I mean, the Ottomans did make some money off of this stuff, but especially something like tobacco. So when it came to economic matters, the Ottomans really lagged behind their European and Western counterparts. And a good indicator of this is the fact that the Ottomans issued capitulations. A capitulation is essentially like it's like granting a sort of favorite status, or a what's a good word for capitulation? Like a favorable status, or an exemption is a good way of putting it. A capitulation is any favorable agreement, we'll just say that, which any favorable agreement which allows for exemption. Now that might not even sound like anything, but what do we mean by capitulation? So for example, when it came to European imports, these were lower taxed. So for example, and why would the Ottomans grant Europeans lower taxation? Well, one was that Europeans were in a stronger economic position. Commodities from the New World were in high demand in the Ottoman state, and European merchants could more or less demand that in the Ottomans. But initially, they had just started off as kind of like favors. The Ottoman Sultan granted favors to certain European firms for whatever reason. Maybe it was of personal gain to the Ottoman state. But this capitulation system really created an uneven balance of power. And even though the Ottoman state fought Europeans on the battlefield, when it came to the actual economics of it, European businesses thrived a lot more. And some of that was due to the fact that they were given these special privileges, or these capitulations. They were exempt from things like taxes or regulation. European culture was also embraced in the Ottoman state. The Tulip period is a period when European culture, U-R-E, was embraced. It gets its term from the tulip craze, which took place in the Dutch Republic, where tulip bulbs were, became like this collector item, and people paid really an extreme price in order to purchase these tulips for whatever reason. But this was seen very much as a move away from tradition, that many of the traditional cultural institutions, the mosques, the clerics, even those ethnic institutions, that by embracing a lot of this European tradition, this was a betrayal in some ways. The Patrona Hali rebellion occurred at the very end of this tulip period. So this was a rebellion by a janissary who forced the Sultan, engaged in this tulip nonsense, so to speak, forced the Sultan to abdicate, and more or less just ran amok in the palace for a period of time. This was in part inspired by, again, kind of this idea that the sultans had become too isolated, too engaged in pleasure, too disconnected from their tradition, their ethnicity, their people, for the most part. The rebellion was essentially put down. Those who were responsible were assassinated, but it really sort of proves or shows you the political instability, right? We might say that, political instability of the Ottoman state, and how the sultans were potentially vulnerable and oblivious. This is an image of, I believe, one of the tombs of the sultans, and so you can see kind of just the decoration and the luxury that the sultans lived in. And constantly, throughout the 16 and 1700s, There were rebellions by both the Janissaries, which again were supposedly loyal to the Sultan, but became kind of this separate political entity, and also Mamluks. Mamluks were a group of people who the Ottomans had conquered previously, but had started reasserting their independence. They were in places like Egypt and Georgia.